Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian with the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. What if you could make a small change that would help you extend your life or just live a little bit longer? Like, who doesn't want to live longer? Because I know I would love to live forever, but I know that's just not possible. But what if cutting your calories by just 10% could add another 5 years to your life? In this podcast, we speak with Dr. Jacob May from the prestigious Pennington Biomedical Research Center on the impact of calorie-restricted diets and their impact on slowing down the aging process. We also explore the sustainability of these types of diets and what's in store with future research. Dr. May is an assistant professor at Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He's also a registered dietitian. He is an expert in human nutrition and metabolism and uses clinical-translational research approaches to understand the link between diet and health. He trained under an NIH T32 grant on Botanical Approaches to Combat Metabolic Syndrome, where he investigated the role of whole grain dietary intake and botanical components on whole body and skeletal muscle protein turnover. Dr. May's additional research interests include understanding the role of nutrition and metabolism in respiratory health, ketone body metabolism, and clinical malnutrition. Although he has a full-time commitment to research, Dr. May actively volunteers for dietetic professional practice groups of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. He is particularly passionate about elevating the dietetic profession and encouraging dietitians to engage in research. Dr. May, thanks so much for joining the All Me podcast today. It's great to have you.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So you have a great, really career path, and or at least your background is really, really strong. I've looked through that. I know you've done a lot of research. Today, we're going to talk about just the whole topic of caloric restriction and anti-aging. But before we do, let's learn a little bit more. Sometimes a bio doesn't tell the whole thing. So give us a little bit about your background, about yourself, your career path, as to how you got where you are today with your research.
Sure, absolutely. So I started my undergraduate career at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio, and I actually started as an engineer. But I always had this side interest in nutrition, and I played football in college. And so I found myself reading much more about how nutrition affects the body than the time I was spending on my engineering homework. And so eventually it got to the point where I was like, oh man, maybe I should transition over. So I changed majors to nutrition around my second, third year there and never looked back. Absolutely fell in love with just the concept of nutrition. So went on to do my PhD at the University of Illinois, Chicago. My focus there was exercise physiology and also nutrition. It was sort of a joint program. I think the technical title is kinesiology, nutrition, and rehabilitation sciences. But to be quite honest, that's when I learned that I don't care at all about exercise physiology. I really I exercise, right? I work out, I'm into it, but I understand its importance. But when I look at research, I mean, I care about the impact of nutrition. And so I took that. I worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, and then also down at Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I'm at now. And I'm now an assistant professor there doing research on the impact of diet and human health.
Excellent. Awesome. It's great. It's always good to hear how someone got into a career path, right? Because sometimes you have this, I wanted to be a pediatrician, right? And my first semester at LSU did not go very well. So what that basically meant was I'm not getting into med school, and I won't tell my story because it's not about that. All right, so let's dive into today's topic. You have an interest in caloric restriction, right? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. What led you to have an interest in that topic?
You know, it was one of those areas that I fell into from my interest in aging, because I find aging very interesting from a nutrition standpoint. I care a lot about clinical malnutrition, which we see in the older adults, right? Which is a consequence of calorie restriction. But then we have another group of researchers at Pennington looking at calorie restriction to promote healthy aging. So I sort of just kind of got involved in it from conversations with them and just getting on a review paper with that group where the focus was, look, we're going to write this paper on how calorie restriction could potentially be an anti-aging component. And my initial thought was like, whoa, like back up for a second, right? I don't want to be inducing malnutrition in older adults. And it was that dichotomy and kind of difference between those two concepts that really just drew my interest in the area.
Right. I mean, like, who doesn't want to get younger? And I know we're going to, dive into that shortly, but let's define calorie restriction, because our listeners are probably like, all right, what does that mean? Like, what is there a number based on specific calories? How does that work?
Yeah, and that really is one of the core questions. So the way we define it for the human research, especially, but also for the like preclinical work, so your animal work, like whether it's flies or mice or the non-human primates, whatever it may be, is calorie restriction. So less calories than you would need for normal basal healthy metabolism with optimal micro and macronutrient profiles. So that means you're eating less calories, but you're still getting all the essential micronutrients. You're still getting all the essential fats you need. So it's calorie restriction on the backdrop of optimal nutrition.
Okay. Now, would the number differ based on someone's weight? Let's say you have a 300-pound person, a 200-pound person, 150. Is it like a percentage based on body weight?
Yeah. And so this is another really great distinction to make. So, when we're talking about calorie restriction, if you have someone that is overweight or especially in the obesity category, reducing body weight has profound effects on all areas of health. I don't even think that's debatable at this point, right? We know that just with about 5% body weight loss, you have dramatic improvements in metabolic health, cardiovascular disease health, and just even mortality, right? So that's kind of undisputed. When we talk about calorie restriction in this context, it's actually talking about relatively healthy weight individuals. So these are people that are within your healthy weight range that are then going to add calorie restriction on top of that. Now, in terms of actually answering your question, I know I went in a nice little loop there. If you look at the research in preclinical models, again, those animal models, the restriction tends to be about 30 to 50% from what they would normally typically eat, which is huge, right? If you're thinking about on the human level, that's cutting out, 700 to 1,000 calories on a 2,000 calorie diet. Huge slice. When we look at the human trials, whether that's from observational studies of looking at different groups or the very few randomized controlled trials that have been done, the restriction seems to be closer to about 10 to 25%. So much lower on that end. So now we're talking about 200 to 500 calories less than you would normally consume for weight maintenance. So that's kind of the distinction that I'll pitch out there, especially for people that are reading this sort of research. Animal models, you'll see a much higher restriction than you will see in the human realm.
So random question, you might be like, hey, Tavis, I've never studied this population, which I'm like, how do you study flies? Like I'm thinking Mr. Miyagi's trying to catch the fly in the Karate Kid. I mean, you can't catch them, and do you do blood work? It's like, I guess you just like, you let them fly around, you don't feed them much. And the one that lives the longest, obviously you can tell that. How do you know which one, is the control group if they're all moving around? Like, so I'm just like, that just came through my brain. So anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's pretty much it. Like, so we essentially have different vials that the flies will live in. And so then you count them as they die. But yeah, it's a different scenario. And I personally have never completed one of the fly studies on my own, but our lab does do them. Same thing with the mice. I typically deal with the human side of the research. So I only peripherally touch the animal work. But I do know there's a lot of work that goes into figuring out how to feed these animals. How do you quantify what their intake is versus their expenditure? That's a whole other area that is really beyond my personal knowledge.
Got it. All right. So when we look at this type of approach of calorie restriction, are there specific foods that you tell subjects, hey, let's avoid or limit this just so it doesn't impact their ability to comply?
Yeah. So I'll give more of a general item that I that I tend to speak about. If you have specific research trials, that they can kind of do it in different ways. Some people would use meal replacement shakes or otherwise, or you could have people live on site in an inpatient setting and feed them all the food that they're going to eat. So there's different ways to do it. When I take it out to an actual dietetic clinical approach, I usually focus on a couple main items. One is high volume, low calorie foods. So these would be items like your soups, right? Especially the thin soups, your salads, a lot of those non-starchy vegetables. So I focus on high calorie, low volume, and then we focus on protein. And so if you can kind of incorporate every meal, if you sit down and you say, hey, do I have a high volume, low calorie food, or maybe two of them, right? A soup and a salad, and then a lean protein. Now you've kind of have a great basis on being able to reduce calories by starting with those foods.
Gotcha. Okay. Now let's dive into the benefits of calorie restriction. So what would be some of the benefits for someone to pursue a calorie restricted type of diet?
Well, let me tell you.
Where do we start?
I'll start with saying the data in humans is really emerging. So I want to make sure everyone listening understands that, we don't have 100% understanding of exactly what's happening in the human body when we undergo calorie restriction. But we have some really cool emerging data and some awesome cohort studies that could give us some just direction in terms of what we think might be happening. So to figure out what those benefits are, let me first talk a little bit about the aging process, I think. So when we have, organismal aging, right? We're just getting older. It happens to every living organism, right? Eventually processes slow down. There's a deterioration in physical function, and it ultimately leads to death. So that process is inevitable, right? And there's two primary factors that feed into that. There's primary aging and secondary aging. And these are just kind of ways to define the processes that happen throughout the aging process. Secondary aging are an easy way to think about it is like external factors. So excess adiposity, toxins in the environment, right? Poor cardiovascular health measures, thinking high cholesterol. So these are items that kind of impact the aging process from what we know about like mortality and otherwise. On the other hand, so that's secondary. On the other hand, there's primary factors. And these primary factors are really, think internal, inside the cells, inside the DNA factors that go along with aging. Think DNA damage, think oxidative stress, think metabolic rate. So those are kind of intrinsic items that lead to the aging process as well. So you have primary factors, which are inevitable, going to happen no matter what. And then you have these secondary factors that can kind of amplify that aging process, especially if you think about the negative effects we know with, high cardiovascular disease markers, high excess body fat, those sort of items. So with that, when you look at aging and what benefit calorie restriction could have, if you talk about calorie restriction to reduce adiposity, like we were talking about earlier, if you have excess body weight, dude, calorie restriction is going to do so much and impact all these measures and have profound benefits. But what about impacting those primary factors that lead to aging? We don't really have any way to impact those yet. The only thing we have in animal models are genetic modifications, right? So you really can't impact those primary aging factors except maybe calorie restriction. And that's what's so unique about calorie restriction is this way to impact these primary factors to aging that just really no other item we have can impact. We could dive into the mechanisms behind that, or we could do that later. You guide me there, but the core concept is the benefits of calorie restriction is potentially slowing those primary aging factors.
Interesting. Okay. So you mentioned a couple of things, and I'm getting a little ahead because it kind of dives into a little bit some of this, because you mentioned some of these things that could accelerate the aging process. And that was kind of my question. What are some things that are people doing today with their lifestyle that's causing them to age faster?
The biggest ones, I think, are just overall having that unhealthy lifestyle that leads to excess body weight and low activity.
So could things like smoking, alcohol intake?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So let's take a deeper dive into the anti-aging, as who doesn't want to slow down their aging process? And you kind of mentioned calorie restriction. You're still studying that, but have you looked at things like telomere length, right, or quality of DNA cells, or is that some of the things that you're exploring? Because I've seen some studies where things like omega-3 supplementation can slow the telomere shortening, right? That's impressive. It's like, well, I take fish oil, and that's just for one reason, but for other reasons, there's many others. So is that one of the things you're looking at from a calorie restricted standpoint?
So the telomere shortening is like a critical factor in the aging process. I don't personally do that sort of research. I don't actually do hands-on conduct these aging trials, but I work with the people that conduct the aging trials, and I've published on the impact of calorie restriction and aging. So I don't want to misrepresent that, I'm sitting there and actually measuring these telomeres or measuring these other items. But what I can say is that in the clinical trials, what they look at physiologic measures that can indicate the aging process. One of the critical trials that have been done in this area is called the Calorie trial. It's spelled a little differently. It's CALERIE, but it's essentially calorie restriction. And they performed it on, let me see if I can pull up the actual numbers, because that would be kind of cool to share with people. Give me one quick second and I'll pull this number. Okay, so the actual title for Calorie stands for Comprehensive Assessment of the Long-Term Effects of Reducing Intake of Energy. And so this was the first randomized clinical trial that was done, and this was done at Pennington Biomedical on calorie restriction. And it was a 6-month trial. They took 48 individuals, men and women, and they gave them 25% energy restriction. Some did it all through diet. Some did a mix of diet and exercise. That wasn't the main concept. What they did was they put them on this calorie restriction, and at the end of the study, they measured one of those primary factors that's related to primary aging. They looked at DNA damage. And what they showed was these individuals that went through this calorie restriction had reduced DNA damage after the calorie restriction as compared to before. And so that's one of those indicators that says, maybe calorie restriction is impacting these primary factors, these primary aging factors. On top of that, they saw reductions in body temperature, another item that is one of those primary factors to aging. So not the telomere length in itself, but other factors that we would agree as a scientific community are kind of related to the aging process.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating information, because I've seen some of these studies, haven't really read them top to bottom, but you see the headlines, you read through some of the abstracts, you look at some of the articles, and talks about calorie restricted diets, how it impacts aging, but also how it extends the life in a variety of species. You've mentioned some of those, mice, flies, etc. Now in humans, you may not have this data yet. And I was like, let me ask this, but do we know, how long does someone have to follow this type of diet to maybe start seeing that benefit, or do we not know those questions yet or answers?
We really don't know exactly. And certainly I think you can kind of imply the obvious, right? The longer you wait to initiate calorie restriction, the less potential benefit you could have, because you've already aged so far. But I think there's something really interesting that can be gained from some of the animal trials. And there have been several studies that have done both in flies and the murine models, at least, where they've taken groups of them and they put half on calorie restriction, half on normal diet, right? And they followed them for, a short period of time. And then they flipped them. They took, half the people that were calorie restricted at first and put them back on a normal diet, half the people that were eating a normal diet, put them on calorie restriction. And what do they see happens? Very quickly, as soon as they change diets, they mimic the same trajectory as if they had done it since the beginning. So, it's hard to extrapolate that to a human time point, but there's something to be said about, look, as soon as you start that, you're instantly kind of moving towards that, what I would consider slower aging trajectory, if we want to call it that. When is the cutoff, right? That would be like, okay, when is too late? And I certainly have some thoughts on that. If you want me to dive into it, I'm happy to. I get concerned with older adults because we know higher body weight tends to be protective. So once you get over the age of 65, the classic BMI mortality curve, I'm sure many of the listeners would be familiar with this as well as you, but it's that J-shaped curve, right? Where really low BMI, you have higher mortality. And then your healthiest BMI is like, 22, 23. And then the higher up it goes, your mortality increases again, right? So it's that J-shaped curve. That J-shaped curve is right shifted in older adults. And when I say that, what I mean is their lowest point, their healthiest for longevity BMI is in the upper 20s. It's like 26, 27. So there's something protective about having that excess weight in older adults. So, if you've gone your whole life and you get there and now you have a little excess adiposity, we're talking just in the relatively healthy range. We're not talking about class 1 to 3 obesity. We're talking just that overweight category. In older adults, that may be more helpful. So initiating calorie restriction at that point and cutting the BMI down may not have the same benefit as it would have had if this was something that was done in your 30s or 40s or 50s, which is where the calorie trial sort of focused.
Yeah. And you mentioned with this type of approach, you lose weight, you lose 5% of your weight. That's going to improve a lot of different outcomes from blood pressure to cholesterol and other healthcare markers. That alone reduces your risk of mortality and extends life. So I know it's hard to really get all the answers and you still have a lot to study. So it's just interesting. Is there anything else outside of just calorie restriction that someone might be able to do to slow the aging process down? And maybe we haven't studied it yet, but is there anything that you can think of that you've seen that says, all right, hey, if we do this, this could also may help a little bit outside of diet?
Boy, there was a decade or so ago, there was a lot of interest in the resveratrol realm and the sirtuins and what impacting them could have on longevity. But I really think that has kind of tapered down over the years to the point where I don't think we generally consider that a major mechanism to use for anti-aging anymore. And so that's what's so exciting about calorie restriction to me is I don't think we've seen anything like this. Certainly not one that has had the human clinical trials to back up some of the other work that have been done in the preclinical models. Because, there have been other preclinical items that have said, hey, this is going to improve longevity. And then you bring it out to humans and we just don't see the same sort of effect. But calorie restriction, there's something special about that where it is showing a lot of potential right now and certainly has some great emerging research in the area.
Now, I want to shift a little bit. I want to keep the topic of calorie restriction, but a lot of people might be listening going, is this the same as fasting, right? Is this intermittent fasting? So for those who may not be familiar with either or, especially fasting, can you explain what makes these two approaches different?
Absolutely. So the calorie restriction is really focused on the end physiologic process, and how you get there, I don't think matters too much, right? So intermittent fasting can be a tool to have calorie restriction happen, but it doesn't have to be, right? So you can practice intermittent fasting and gain weight if you eat enough. Right. So calorie restriction, on the other hand, says, look, long-term, we are going to reduce the amount of calories that you're eating. And I want to be clear, there's not just an endless weight loss, right? So let's say you sit there every day, you eat 2,000 calories a day and you maintain your body weight. If you go through this calorie restriction process, you're going to lose a little weight, right? But then you stabilize. And so now you're eating lower calories, and that weight you stabilize at is really not directly related to what you would guess it would be if you just reduce those calories. So there's changes that go on in your body to make you utilize or use energy a little differently. So we're not just saying, hey, lose weight. And then if you plug that weight into a calculator, that's the amount of calorie estimate that you would come out with. There's something different. And this goes beyond what we know about these calorie estimators that are out there. Something happens physiologically to let you sustain a body weight at a different calorie intake than you would have otherwise. So that's what's so unique about it too, is it's not just this constantly losing weight, always reducing calories. You're stabilizing at a new lower weight, and you're consuming calories that are not necessarily consistent with what we would anticipate that you would be consuming if you didn't lose that weight or practice calorie restriction in the first place.
Now, we've talked about the benefits, right? So with anything, I want to change the subject a little bit and get the opposite. Are there any potential risk with following a calorie restricted diet?
There's a couple. The first and most prominent one in my mind is the one with older adults that we talked about, with BMI and the J-shaped curve and the right shifting in aging. So you don't have that potential protective effect of slightly higher adiposity that might be beneficial. The other one is you do lose lean body mass, right? And we know lean body mass in itself is protective, and it's extremely important for mobility and strength and maintaining quality of life and independence as you get older. So there is a potential concern that if you undergo calorie restriction, you will have less muscle mass than if you didn't undergo calorie restriction. Does that matter is the major question. The debate can kind of focus around, okay, you have less muscle mass, but how does the muscle function look? If you're maintaining mobility and maintaining similar strength, or even maintaining that for a longer period of time because the aging process slowed, well, then it's not a big deal. But if you lose that muscle mass and now you're going to be required to, as an older adult, live in a care facility before you would have otherwise if you would have had more muscle mass, well, that's a big issue. And we don't know the answer to that just yet. They have done cool work in the calorie studies. They did calorie, and they also followed it up with Calorie 2, which was a similar trial. And they measured muscle function as well. So what they saw was that, yes, people lost lean mass, but they lost it in general proportion to the weight they lost, meaning they ended up with less body fat percentage than the individuals that didn't do the calorie restriction. So, okay, yes, you're losing total mass, but it's loss that's proportional to your overall body weight. So that's good. And they also maintained relative muscle function. So they didn't cross barriers that we would consider to have like weakness or items that you relate with sarcopenia or some of those other aging related muscle strength disorders. So there's a potential that muscle function is maintained through the loss of muscle mass. Again, only some early data suggesting that. So those would be my primary concerns. Is losing that excess adiposity not actually helpful in the long term in humans? And is losing that excess muscle mass not helpful in the long term in humans? Unanswered questions, but those would be my concerns.
Now, with any type of diet, when you're cutting calories, there's a concern about compliance. Have you seen any difficulties, or how difficult it is to follow a calorie restricted diet as, sustainability? What have you seen in this area?
It's tough. So the calorie trials aimed to have 25% calorie reduction from someone's normal daily intake, right? And they looked at compliance, and they looked at how many calories people were actually able to restrict by. And it came out to about 11 to 12%. That was sort of the long-term sustainable calorie restriction. And this was over the course of 2 years. So it's pretty lengthy at this point. They could maintain about that 12% restriction throughout 2 years, and that's averaging the total calorie restriction of the time. And this was actually really cool to see because it mirrors what we see in observational studies. So you may be familiar with like the blue zones, right? Just like areas on the earth where we just have a ton of people that get over 100 years old, those centenarians. Why do those areas have higher concentrations of these people, right? When you look at them, several of them, at least individuals in like Okinawa, Japan, that they've looked at, people on the northeast, south, west coast of the United States that just practice calorie restriction. There's a society. It's the Calorie Restriction with Optimal Nutrition. It's a group of people that just naturally follow calorie restriction, right? And they tend to consume about 11, 12% less calories than they would if they weren't practicing calorie restriction. So it seems like about that 11 to 12% range seems to be what is feasible in humans. Do we know if that's the realm where you see the most benefit? who knows, but that seems to be about the range. And so to bring that out to like, if someone's sitting there today and be like, yeah, I eat 2,500 calories a day, how much do I have to cut out? It's only like 250 calories. It's not a really massive amount that you're cutting. It's
not like you're going to like 1,000 calorie starvation diet.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. No, that's interesting. I mean, I'm like, oh, this is a calorie restricted group. I wonder if they're happy, if they're aggravated all the time because they're in a deficit, but maybe they're not in a massive deficit. So it's great that you pointed that out. Now, let's say what type of approach, that you take if someone is exploring calorie restriction. For example, you and I know it's not easy for someone to go for a high calorie diet to a much lower calorie diet without seeing a significant change in hunger. So is there a progression? Now, you might say, hey, it's only 10%, which that's not drastic, but is there the progression where you would recommend of trying this approach, or you just dive right into it?
So if the goal is just for the calorie restriction potential longevity benefits, I'd probably say just dive right in. If it's more for the situation we were talking about earlier, where you have someone with overweight or obesity and you need to lose weight, there's different approaches. There's a slow approach. Some people say taper it in, and that's fine and viable. Right. Personally, and what we use in a lot of weight management clinics is a really intensive approach to start, and then trying to maintain a substantial weight loss. So, in the first 3 months, you may have someone go on something similar to the very low calorie diets, using meal replacements twice a day, and then maybe a smaller dinner, and lose a substantial amount of weight in those first, 12 weeks, 3 months. We're talking 10% body weight. And then you try and maintain that and reincorporate more of a normal eating practice. So that's my personal favorite approach, and one that also tends to find itself in the methodology of some of these long-term weight loss trials. Great examples for people to reference are the Look Ahead trial and the diabetes prevention program. If you look into their counselor material, which is publicly available, by the way, you can dive into that, and then you'll see they have recommendations to use meal replacements or other items to really reduce calorie intake early, lose a significant amount of weight, and then try and maintain that. And there's also data that shows faster weight loss early is indicative of better sustained weight loss as well. So for all those reasons, that's kind of my go-to. But I will say, having worked with many people, some people respond way better to a slower approach. So I think it's really important to make sure everyone focuses on an individualized approach and what's going to work best for any single person. Because I've seen the opposite happen. I've seen people succeed better using that slow sort of tapered approach and slowly increasing that restriction over time. So although, I have my personal preferences or bias or whatever you may call it, I think an individualized approach is maybe obviously what's going to work best.
Sure. Well, and I see some of these programs out there today, 1,000 calories, 1,100 calories, and somebody might go from 3,000 to 1,000. And we know some of these hormones like ghrelin and leptin that control hunger, and fullness, they could probably be altered pretty quickly if you make too much of a drop too fast. Is that correct?
That wouldn't surprise me one bit. I'm sure there's so many physiologic regulations that go on, even things we don't know about, right? Like signals in the brain. One of my favorite ones to talk about with people is food seeking behavior. So we know this from animal models, right? If you reduce their food, they do things like increase their food seeking behavior. They'll go around looking for food. And we don't really have that sort of exact translation in humans, but I've found from counseling people, something I'll hear quite often is, I find myself looking in my food pantry, and I didn't mean to go there, but I'm there. And so now I'm eating food. And so that's something that I just like, sometimes I sit back and it's kind of my, hippie vision of like, all right, man, like the body's telling you to do something. And so is there this inherent increase in food seeking behavior that is having people gravitate towards these areas where then you eat more? I mean, there's so much that goes on regulation wise that we just don't really know. And the hormones you mentioned could play a role in that or other areas. So there's just so much that happens that we don't know about.
Yeah. And I read a book, Atomic Habits, that really, it talks a lot about like why we eat certain things. And there's certain cues. If you like you mentioned, if you walk by your pantry, you do the same thing every day, your brain remembers that and it cues you to go, oh, it's time to go to the pantry and grab that whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, wow, that's fascinating. I've done that so many times. Or when I used to drive to New Orleans to work every day, I'd get off, go to the same gas station, get something to drink, get on the Causeway Bridge. And I'm like, wow, I haven't done that in so long. One day I just got off and went, oh, it's the same queue. Interesting. Now, as we kind of get closer to the end, one of the things is, when you're going to a calorie restricted diet, is there a certain macronutrient split, or do you say, hey, really focus on keeping your protein at a certain level, fiber, fat, et cetera, that helps when transitioning?
The best advice I could probably give is make sure you're maintaining optimal nutrition in terms of your micronutrients and macronutrient needs. So those are your essential fats, right? So we consider about 20% fat intake to be the lowest end you want in terms of making sure your body has the fats it needs. Certainly make sure you have all the micronutrients in place. In terms of protein, the calorie studies used 50% above the RDA. So they used 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. I think that's a great number to aim for. There's good data in athletes to suggest going higher may help preserve muscle mass more. So I would say if you go into the range of 1.5 grams to 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, if you're in the scenario where you're doing an extreme weight loss, that may be beneficial. For something like the calorie restriction, which is very mild compared to a lot of weight loss strategies, I'd probably say if you're anywhere in that range of 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, I see very little benefit for going beyond that. And I see little downside to going down to about 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. So that's kind of the range that I would say is suggestive of being the healthiest for body composition based on the calorie trials and completely separate trials on weight loss and protein intake.
Let's talk age restrictions. You've mentioned that older than 65, but let's go the opposite spectrum. So are there any age restrictions when it comes to youth? So let's say you have a parent of a 13-year-old going through puberty, feels their child needs to lose weight. It's like, oh, my son or daughter is way overweight. Would this approach be appropriate for a young developing individual?
With youth, there's so much we want to ensure in terms of them having a healthy relationship with food, because it's also a really tough time for the development of eating disorders. So I'm not saying calorie restriction of some sort wouldn't be beneficial. And in many youth with overweight or obesity, it certainly is, as far as improving quality of life, which would kind of be like your number one factor, right? Like, do you feel better? So there are benefits, but I think the most important thing would be work with a professional. And I would go as far to say work with a registered dietitian, even a step farther, saying one that works with adolescents. And I think there's something important to know with professionals that work in the nutrition or food or diet realm, whether you're a dietitian or just a health coach or otherwise. I think it's important to recognize where your limitations are. And that's one of the scenarios where I would say, you know what, this is a potentially dicey area. Let's make sure we have the absolute best expertise to work with a group that may have higher risk in terms of long-term development than other groups.
Yeah, and you mentioned a little bit about athletes and maybe how they can approach it. Let's say we have athletes in weight-controlled sports, wrestlers, power lifters, anybody trying to make weight. We know they have a tendency to go through some extreme dieting approaches. And maybe this type of diet would be a benefit of them if they did it the right way and not all of a sudden just cut a drastic amount of calories, I would think.
It might be, the weight cycling sports are so unique in that, you're trying to hit certain weights on a scale, and it's not always directly indicative of body composition changes. You're well aware we have all these major fluctuations in water weight that can be manipulated to hit certain numbers. Performance can be impacted if you don't have the right calorie intake in athletes. So, I don't honestly know if this would be a great approach. I mean, when I think about athletes, I think performance and I think higher calories. And then I think about the weight manipulation as sort of a short-term approach to manipulating all the tissue that you've built into just weighing less for a short period of time. But that's just sort of my personal view on it. I've only worked with a couple athletes in weight cycling sports, along with just myself. I was a wrestler in high school as well.
Yeah. So, it's, I've seen some of these kids, oh, I need to lose 7 pounds in a week. And I'm like, yeah, that's not good. That's not the approach to take. And that's not going to be fat mass. That's going to be all fluid.
Yep.
All right. Last question for you, Dr. May, is what type of research do you see in the near future that's going to really look at the approach when it comes to any outcomes maybe that we haven't studied when it comes to caloric restriction? Where do you see future research being explored?
My personal interest is in the realm of precision nutrition. And this would be using an individual's biometrics, dietary habits, lifestyle, exercise, certainly their demographics, and plugging that all together and finding a way to give them a personalized, tailored approach to nutrition. And I'm doing some work in this realm now. I know Pennington Biomedical just received a huge amount of funding to do a large precision nutrition study also. So I think that individualized nutrition therapy will really be an exciting area in the future, and hopefully something that can breach the realm of medical nutrition therapy for dietitians. I think it's just really exciting. I am working on contributing to that literature, and I'm certainly excited to implement those sort of items in private practice as well.
Awesome. Fascinating. Well, before we go, first, thank you for your time. Incredible information. I love anything new related to nutrition and research. But we have what's called the curveball round. This is the fun time where we ask you questions that's really nothing related to our topic today. The first question I like to ask, because I'm a music junkie, I love music. I play music. I've probably been to close to 350 concerts. So if you could be the lead singer of any band, who would that be?
Oh, goodness. So I full disclosure, I was never good at baseball. So like as soon as I was good at pitching machine, right? But as soon as a real person had to throw a ball at me, oof, I was done. That was like way too much. So let's see. My favorite band would probably be Pearl Jam, but my concern would be Eddie Vedder is so good. I don't think I would want to sing instead of him,
That's
so
awesome.
geez.
So I have 2 Pearl Jam posters on my wall because I've seen them at Wrigley Field twice. I've seen them
jealous.
I've seen them in Fenway Park once and 15 other times.
Oh, that's so awesome. I just started listening to their 2020 album Gigaton.
Right.
And I absolutely love it. They baffle me about how much great music they can just continue to put out over decades. It's crazy.
Right. It's rare. All right. If you could research any topic, just one topic for the rest of your life, what would that be?
Ketogenesis or protein metabolism, or maybe both. A nice merger of the two of those, I think, would be really cool. Just understanding a little bit more about the ketone body metabolism and potentially how that affects our lean body mass regulations or protein retention.
I came up with that as we were kind of going through this. This is a question I've never asked someone before. And this last question I've never asked either. So what is something you really wanted as a kid that your parents were like, Jake, there's just no way you're getting that right now?
Ooh, let's see. Man, honestly, dude, I came up pretty humble upbringings. We didn't really, I can't think of a single thing that I was like, man, I really want that. Because we just kind of went along and we had what we had and we moved on that way.
Is there something you wanted to do, or is there just something in general that you're like, your parents are against? Maybe you wanted to sneak out and go see a band, or
man, I don't know, dude. My parents were awesome. My parents are really great. I would say maybe as a kid, for whatever reason, I said Lamborghini really early. And so I guess I'd always kind of want like a purple Lamborghini with suicide doors. So maybe that would kind of be my like, all right, tell you what, like, let's go with that. I'll pitch that one to my wife. I'll put that on her. I'll put that on her plate.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure she'll be like, okay, when you make all this money one day, then you can get it for yourself. Well, Dr. May, thank you so much. Fascinating information. We really appreciate the time and the energy and spending it with us this afternoon.
Pleasure to be on. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Thank you. We'll have you back in the near future.
Awesome.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.